Hello everyone, I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today we're diving into a story where love is ready for a new beginning, but hidden tensions are quietly rising. What happens when two families from completely different worlds finally come face to face at a wedding? Will love be enough to bridge the gap, or will unseen intentions turn this happy moment into something much more complicated? Stay with me to find out. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to hit subscribe so you won't miss the next episode. The drive back to the apartment felt quieter than before. Not uncomfortable, just filled with thoughts that neither of them said out loud. Tieu Lac sat in the back seat, holding their 9-month-old daughter close. The baby had fallen asleep halfway through the ride, her tiny fingers still clutching the edge of Tieu Lac's sleeve, as if she didn't want to let go. The city lights slowly came back into view, one by one, stretching across the horizon like something familiar returning after a long absence. But inside Tieu Lac, nothing felt settled yet. The CEO kept his eyes on the road, his expression calm, almost unreadable. If someone had looked at him from the outside, they would have thought everything had gone smoothly. And in a way, it had. His father didn't oppose, his mother didn't refuse. The wedding wasn't stopped, but it wasn't truly accepted either. And that difference, he understood it better than anyone. "You're thinking about something," he said quietly, without turning around. Tieu Lac hesitated, then gave a small nod, even though he couldn't see it. "A little," she admitted. He didn't press, because he already knew. When the car stopped in front of their apartment building, the familiar sense of calm returned. Soft lights, quiet surroundings, a place that belonged only to them. Home. The CEO stepped out first, then walked around to open the door for her. He reached out, carefully taking the baby so Tieu Lac could step out more easily. "Let me," he said gently. She smiled faintly, a small gesture, but one that meant everything. Inside, the apartment felt just as they had left it. Nothing had changed, and yet, everything had. Tieu Lac walked slowly toward the living room, her eyes scanning the space, almost as if she was grounding herself again. The silence here was different from the villa. It didn't carry expectation, it didn't carry judgment. It simply held them. The CEO placed the baby into her crib, adjusting the blanket with a kind of care that had become second nature to him. For a moment, he just stood there, watching her sleep, peacefully, unaffected. "We did it," he said softly. Tieu Lac looked at him. "Did we?" she asked. Not doubt, just honesty. He didn't answer right away, because he knew what they had done was only the beginning. Later that night, after everything had quieted down, Tieu Lac stood by the window again. It had become a habit. Whenever her thoughts grew heavy, she stood there, looking out, trying to find clarity somewhere beyond the glass. The CEO noticed, of course. He always did. He walked over slowly, stopping just behind her. "You're still worried," he said. This time, she didn't deny it. "I'm thinking about my mom," she said softly. There it was, the one thing she hadn't said the entire ride home. The CEO's expression shifted slightly. Not surprised, just attentive. "She doesn't know yet," Tieu Lac continued. "Not really, not everything." Her fingers tightened slightly against each other. "I don't even know how to tell her about the wedding." The CEO leaned against the wall beside her. "She'll be happy for you," he said. Tieu Lac shook her head slowly. "It's not that simple." A pause, then, "She lives in a completely different world," Tieu Lac said. "Everything is simple there, direct, honest." Her voice softened. "But your family..." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. The CEO exhaled quietly. "I understand what you're afraid of," he said. She turned to look at him. "Do you?" she asked, not challenging, just searching. He nodded. You're afraid she'll be treated the way you were. Silence, but this time it was clear. Tieu Lac looked away again, her eyes drifting back to the city lights. I don't want her to feel small, she whispered. I don't want her to feel like she doesn't belong. Her voice trembled slightly now. She's my mother. But in your family's world, she'll just be someone from a place they don't understand. The CEO watched her carefully. Every word, every hesitation, every fear she tried to hold back. She won't be alone, he said firmly. Tieu Lac didn't respond because she wanted to believe him. But belief wasn't enough to erase what she had already experienced. What if your mother, she began, then stopped. He waited. What if she treats my mom the same way she treated me, she finally said. The question hung there, heavy, real. The CEO stepped closer. Not too close, just enough. She won't, he said. Then after a pause, I won't let her. This time, Tieu Lac looked at him. Really looked. There was no hesitation in his eyes, no uncertainty. And for the first time that night, something inside her loosened. Just a little. But will she come? He asked gently. Tieu Lac's expression softened again. I don't know, she admitted. She's never left the village for something like this. A small smile appeared. She'll probably worry about everything. What to wear, what to say, how to act. The CEO almost smiled. That sounds familiar. Tieu Lac let out a quiet laugh. And just like that, the heaviness lifted. Slightly, but only slightly, because deep down, the question still remained. Would her mother come? Would she feel welcome? Would this wedding truly be a beginning, or another test they had to pass? That night, as they lay beside each other, neither of them spoke much. But both of them were thinking the same thing. Love had brought them this far, but now, it wasn't just about them anymore. It was about families. Two worlds, two lives, trying to stand in the same place, and whether that place would hold or quietly begin to crack was something neither of them could answer yet. The night didn't bring immediate answers, but it brought something else, a quiet decision. The next morning, sunlight slipped gently through the curtains, touching everything in the room with a soft warmth. The baby woke up early, as usual, her small voice breaking the silence in a way that felt almost comforting. Tieu Lac sat up slowly, still a little lost in her thoughts from the night before. She looked at her daughter, then at the phone on the bedside table, and she knew she couldn't delay it any longer. She picked up the phone, paused, put it down again. Call her, the CEO said quietly from behind. She turned slightly. He was already awake, watching her, not pushing, just there. What if she says no? Tieu Lac asked softly. What if she's afraid to come? The CEO leaned his head slightly against the headboard. Then at least you'll know, he said. A small pause. And we'll find a way. Tieu Lac nodded, took a breath, and this time she called. The phone rang, once, twice, 3 times. Then, a familiar voice. Tieu Lac? Her chest tightened instantly. Me, she said softly. Just that one word, and everything she had been holding back almost slipped through. You're okay? Her mother asked quickly. Everything's all right. I heard some things from the neighbors. Tieu Lac closed her eyes briefly. I'm okay, she said. We're all okay. A pause, then her mother's voice softened. That's good. For a moment, neither of them spoke, because sometimes silence between family didn't mean distance, it meant feeling too much. Me, Tieu Lac continued, her voice slower now. I wanted to tell you something. Her mother waited, quietly. I'm getting married, Tieu Lac said, simple, direct. On the other end, silence, not shock, not confusion, just stillness. To him, her mother asked. Yes, Another pause, longer this time. Then, a soft exhale. "I thought so," her mother said gently. Tieu Lac blinked. "You knew?" "I didn't know," her mother replied, "but I could feel it." A faint smile in her voice. "You've already chosen him for a long time, haven't you?" Tieu Lac didn't answer. She didn't need to. "I'm not calling to ask for permission," she added quietly. "I just want you there." There it was, the real question. On the other side of the line, her mother didn't answer right away. "City weddings are different," she said slowly. "I don't know how to dress, how to speak, how to—" "Me," Tieu Lac interrupted softly. "You don't have to change anything." A pause. "I just need you there." Silence again, but this time it felt different. "I'll come," her mother said at last. Tieu Lac's fingers tightened around the phone. "Really?" "I'll come," her mother repeated, a small, quiet strength in her voice now. "You're my daughter." And just like that, something inside Tieu Lac settled. But before she could say anything else, her mother added one more sentence, soft but not light. "Just tell me one thing." Tieu Lac held her breath. "Will I be welcome there?" The question, simple, but it carried everything. Tieu Lac's eyes slowly filled. "Yes," she said, without hesitation, "because if you're not, then neither am I." The line went quiet again, but this time there was no doubt left. After the call ended, Tieu Lac sat still for a long moment, the phone still in her hand, her eyes distant but calm. "She's coming," she said softly. The CEO nodded. "I knew she would." But his expression didn't fully relax because he knew something else too. One side was ready, the other side was still unknown. Later that afternoon, in a completely different part of the city, the CEO's mother sat alone in her private room. A cup of tea untouched in front of her. A file lay open on the table. Not business, not contracts. Information about Tieu Lac's family. Her background, her village, her mother, every detail. She turned a page slowly, her expression unreadable. "So, she's coming," she murmured. No anger, no surprise, just calculation. Her fingers tapped lightly against the table, once, twice. Then she picked up her phone, dialed a number. "I want everything prepared," she said calmly. "Nothing out of place." A pause. "And make sure," her voice lowered slightly, "that she understands where she is." The call ended, and in that moment, it became clear the wedding would happen. But it would not be simple, because while one family came with love, the other was still deciding how much of that love they were willing to allow. Tieu Lac and the CEO returned to their luxury apartment with their 9-month-old daughter after announcing their wedding plans to his parents. Although the visit seemed successful, Tieu Lac remains anxious about whether her mother from the countryside can attend the wedding and whether she will be treated with respect. After a heartfelt phone call, her mother agrees to come, despite feeling nervous about entering a world so different from her own. Tieu Lac promises that if her mother is not welcomed, then she will not feel welcomed either. Meanwhile, the CEO's mother quietly gathers information about Tieu Lac's family and begins making her own preparations. As the wedding approaches, love and family are about to collide, and the question remains: will this ceremony bring unity or expose deeper divisions?